The city pulsed with restless energy, a living, breathing thing beneath the electric glow of Times Square. Cabs honked in impatient bursts. Footsteps tapped hurriedly along slick pavement, blending with the rhythmic murmur of street vendors calling out their latest deals. The crisp night air carried the scent of roasting chestnuts from a corner cart, mixing with the sharper tang of gasoline, a contradiction of warmth and steel, much like the city itself. Manhattan never slept, but on this particular evening, beneath the towering billboards flashing their endless cycle of advertisements, something else stirred, something quieter, something far more profound. Ivanka Trump, daughter of the former President of the United States, was in town for a high-profile charity gala, the kind of glittering affair where diamond-clad socialites clinked champagne glasses and toasted to philanthropy between bites of imported caviar. It was a night designed for opulence disguised as generosity, and it had drained her. She had excused herself early, slipping away from the performative small talk, the rehearsed pleasantries, the air of curated nobility that often surrounded such events. Because she had always believed that helping others should be about action, not just words, not just donations for the sake of status. So instead of retreating to her hotel suite, where the world would expect her to go, she turned down a quieter street, a spontaneous decision. The biting wind tugged at the hem of her coat as she walked toward a small, unassuming 24-hour diner. The kind with flickering neon signs and cracked leather booths, the kind where the forgotten souls of the city gathered for warmth and a cheap cup of coffee. She hadn't expected to find anything that night, hadn't expected a story to be waiting for her. But then, a sound stopped her mid-step. Not the usual city noise, not an argument, not the distant wail of a siren. Number something else. A cry. A baby's cry. Her breath hitched as she turned, scanning the dimly lit street. And then, she saw it. A small bundle, tucked into the corner of an alleyway, wrapped in nothing but a tattered old coat. Her pulse roared in her ears. Number it couldn't be. Her feet moved before she could process it, her designer heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she rushed forward, her coat billowing in the wind. As she knelt down, her hands trembled. And then, she found him. A baby, no older than 6 months. His tiny body stiff from the cold, his cheeks flushed from exposure, his lips trembling as another whimper escaped. Alone, abandoned, hungry. Ivanka's vision blurred, a collision of shock and anger flooding through her. Who could do this? Who could leave an innocent child like this? In the dark, in the cold, in a world that already didn't care enough. She scooped the baby into her arms, his fragile frame light as air, yet heavy with something she couldn't name. His tiny fingers curled instinctively against the warmth of her coat. "Shh," she whispered, cradling him closer, shielding him from the wind. And then, a sudden movement. A shadow stirred just a few feet away. Her breath caught. The man hesitated. For a second, he seemed to wrestle with the truth, as though admitting it aloud would make it all the more real. And then, he nodded. His entire body sagged beneath the weight of it. Ivanka's grip on the baby tightened instinctively, her pulse roaring in her ears. A protective fire flared inside her, primal, fierce, immediate. "You left him in an alley?" she hissed, her voice sharp with a fury she couldn't contain. Her eyes flashed, not with judgment, but with undeniable anger. "He could have died out here," the man flinched. His gaze dropped, shame carving itself into the deep, weathered lines of his face. I didn't know what else to do," he whispered. His voice was wrecked, barely a breath. The baby had stopped crying, instinctively burrowing deeper into the warmth of Ivanka's embrace, his small body no longer trembling from the cold. The man, his name was Jacob, rubbed his face with calloused, trembling hands. "I lost everything," he murmured, his voice raw, hollowed out by grief. Ivanka watched as his shoulders curved inward, as if trying to collapse into himself, as if trying to shrink away from the unbearable weight of his own past. "My wife died last year," he continued, his breath uneven. "Cancer." Ivanka felt something twist inside her chest. Jacob swallowed hard. "And then I lost my job. I couldn't pay rent. They threw us out. He exhaled shakily, his hands curling into fists at his sides as if trying to hold himself together. I tried. I did. His voice broke, the sound of a man clinging to the last fragile pieces of himself. But shelters don't have space for a man with a baby. No one would take both of us. Ivanka gripped the child a little tighter, feeling the small, steady rise and fall of his chest against her own. The image of them, a father and his child, alone in the brutal, unforgiving sprawl of the city, burrowed into her bones. Jacob let out a shuddering breath, his gaze flickering toward the baby, his expression breaking apart. I thought. He hesitated, his throat bobbed, and when he finally spoke again, his voice shattered. I thought maybe if I left him somewhere safe, someone better could take care of him. Ivanka felt a lump rise in her throat. The weight of his words hit her like a fist to the gut. This was not a deadbeat father, not a monster, not someone who had stopped caring. This was a man who had been broken by the world, a man who had once been a husband, a provider, a protector, and was now standing in the freezing dark, a father so desperate, so completely abandoned, that he believed his only option was to walk away from his own flesh and blood. Tears burned behind Ivanka's eyes. I thought, as she swallowed against the tightness in her throat. I don't believe that, she said softly, her voice carrying something gentler now, something that felt like understanding. Jacob's breath hitched. He looked away, his fingers twitching like they wanted to reach for the baby, but knew they had no right to. Ivanka took a small step closer, her grip still protective, but her gaze no longer filled with just anger. You didn't leave him because you didn't care, she said, her words steady but thick with emotion. You left him because the world made you believe you weren't good enough. Jacob shuddered. A broken sob escaped his lips. The sound of it, raw, unfiltered pain, cut through the cold air like a blade. No one helps men like me, he whispered, his voice barely audible now, like a man who had forgotten how to be heard. People see me on the street, and they think I'm worthless. His fingers curled into the frayed edges of his coat, his shoulders hunched against an invisible weight that had pressed on him for far too long. They don't see a father. He exhaled, a sound so defeated it made Ivanka's chest ache. They don't see a man trying. The words clawed at her, slicing through the barriers between them, because he was right. And somehow, that made this so much worse, because she knew he was right. People love to talk about compassion, love to preach about charity, love to post about it. Polished words, empty gestures, fleeting concern wrapped in well-meaning rhetoric. But how many actually stopped? How many looked past the statistics, past the assumptions, past their own discomfort, and saw the humanity behind the struggle? Saw the man before the misfortune? Ivanka took a deep breath, her chest tight with something she couldn't quite name. And then, she made her decision, no hesitation, no doubt, just a single moment of clarity. She looked down at the baby, so fragile, so small, so completely unaware of the cruel world he had been born into. Then she lifted her gaze, met Jacob's eyes. Come with me, she said. Jacob stiffened, his entire body locked in place, as if he had just misheard her. What? Ivanka didn't waver. I can help, she pressed, her voice calm, steady, certain. But you need to trust me. Jacob stared at her, suspicion warring with hope. Hope was the more dangerous of the two, because hope had a way of crushing you when it turned out to be false. Why? He whispered, his voice small, raw, worn from too much loss. Why would you help us? Ivanka exhaled. Her heart ached at the question, because that right there, was the deepest wound. Not just the homelessness, not just the hunger, not just the loss of a wife, a home, a life. It was this, the inability to believe that anyone could still look at him and see something worth saving. Because you're right, she said. People don't stop to help men like you. A pause, a breath, a truth too heavy to ignore. And that needs to change. The next morning, the world woke up to a story they never expected. Ivanka Trump, the billionaire's daughter, had spent the night helping a homeless father and his baby. But it didn't end there. Because she didn't just take a photo, didn't just write a check, didn't just walk away once the cameras turned off. She followed through. She arranged for Jacob to be placed in a permanent housing program, secured a job for him. And then she used her platform, her name, her influence, not to make herself look good, but to call for real change, to push for better policies for struggling parents, especially single fathers. The media exploded. Some called it a publicity stunt. Others praised it as a... But for Jacob, it was something far simpler. It was a second chance. And for the first time in over a year, as he stood inside his new home, the walls solid, the warmth real, the weight on his chest just a little lighter, he looked down at his son, held him close, and allowed himself to believe in something he thought he had lost forever. What would you do? This wasn't just a news story. It was a defining moment about second chances, about looking beyond assumptions, about real action over empty words. Have you ever been in a situation where someone needed help and you had the power to make a difference? How did you respond? Would you have done what Ivanka did? Share your thoughts below. If you believe in helping, not judging, in real change over performative gestures, and in lifting people up when the world looks away, hit subscribe now. Let's talk about the moments that truly matter.